The storm that rolled in that night wasn't loud, but it carried a heaviness that settled over the quiet suburban neighborhood like a warning no one could hear. Inside the modest two-story home with the pale blue shutters, a single lamp glowed in the front room, illuminating a woman sitting perfectly still on the edge of the couch. Her hands, cold and unsteady, pressed against a document she had never expected to find, an unsigned will tucked inside a leather folder, left behind on her husband's desk as if waiting for her eyes alone. And in that moment, as the world outside slowed to a hush, she felt something inside her break. Not because the inheritance was missing, not because the numbers didn't add up, but because the signature line where her name should have been was replaced by another. The name of her mother-in-law, clear, intentional, final. The room smelled faintly of rain and printer ink, and somewhere in the house a door creaked as if the walls themselves were shifting under the weight of a truth long buried. She stared at the page again, hoping it would change, hoping it would make sense. But the truth didn't bend. It only revealed itself slowly, like a wound that had always been there but finally split open. For years she had trusted them, believing that family meant safety, unity, and honesty. But tonight, one simple document exposed everything she had tried so hard to ignore. The whispered conversations, the sudden coldness, the late-night phone calls, the subtle but deliberate distance that had begun to form between her and the man she loved. And now she realized it had never been accidental. It had been guided, orchestrated, designed. Before we go deeper into this chilling case, I'd like you watching to ground yourself in the moment with us. As you follow this story, share the very first reaction that hits your heart. Was it disbelief, anger, or recognition? And if you have ever seen money, loyalty, or family pressure twist someone into a stranger, tell us what you noticed first. Your thoughts help shape the way these stories live on, long after the final truth is exposed. The beginning was far calmer than the end. It always is. It started in the kind of quiet, well-kept neighborhood where people waved from their porches and pretended not to see the cracks forming behind closed curtains. The kind of place where everyone believed they understood their neighbors because the lawns were trimmed and the holiday decorations came out on time. But inside the Donovan family, beneath the surface of polite smiles and perfectly framed photos, something darker had been simmering for years. Something rooted in control, legacy, and the kind of possessiveness that didn't look dangerous at first glance. That's how these stories begin. Not with violence or chaos, but with a single emotion buried too deep to confront. Michael Donovan was the kind of man people trusted instantly. Steady, calm, thoughtful. At 44, he carried himself with quiet confidence. The kind that came from years of working as a financial analyst who believed in predictability, order, and responsibility. His colleagues described him as loyal. His friends described him as generous. His wife, Alina, once described him as the safest place she had ever known. But even the safest places can contain fault lines invisible until pressure makes them split. Alina was 39, a licensed counselor who spent most of her days listening to people unravel their deepest fears. She was soft-spoken, observant, and steady in ways most people struggled to be. She believed in healing, in communication, in building bridges instead of walls. When she met Michael 13 years earlier at a conference in San Diego, she fell for the gentleness in his eyes, the way he spoke without rushing, the way he made her feel seen in a world that often overlooked quiet people. Their marriage, at least in the early years, seemed unshakable. They shared coffee every morning. They talked through disagreements. They planned simple, grounded futures rather than extravagant dreams. They saw themselves as partners. But there was always a third presence in their relationship, silent at first, then impossibly loud. Her name was Evelyn Donovan, Michael's mother. Evelyn was a woman of sharp intelligence and a sharper will, the kind of mother who loved fiercely but possessed iveness turned her affection into something territorial. She had spent decades building herself up from poverty into a respected real estate investor, accumulating properties, connections, and influence along the way. Beneath her controlled exterior, however, lay a deep insecurity, the fear of losing her son to another woman. A fear that grew stronger as the years passed, especially after her husband died unexpectedly, leaving her without the one person who had tempered her intensity. Reports from neighbors described her as elegant but intimidating. Friends said she was determined, sometimes to a fault. But those closest to her family members who preferred to stay anonymous, allegedly described her differently. She believed loyalty was obedience, one relative claimed, and she believed family money should stay with family no matter what. The inheritance, the one that would eventually total $2.9 million, was something Evelyn had been building across decades. Rental properties across Southern California, a few smart stock decisions, and a life insurance policy her late husband had purchased before his passing. To her, this wasn't just money. It was legacy, identity, control, and she had always assumed it would pass seamlessly to her only child. But then Michael married Alina, and everything changed. In the early years, Evelyn masked her disapproval behind polite smiles and carefully chosen comments. She welcomed Alina during holidays, bought her gifts, invited her to dinners. But beneath the surface, she watched, evaluated, measured. And as the couple strengthened their bond, Evelyn's restraint thinned. She became more vocal about her opinions, how Alina dressed, how she managed her career, how she and Michael handled finances. There were moments, small at first, when she insisted on speaking to Michael alone. Moments when she inserted herself into decisions that belonged only to the couple. Moments when she spoke as if Alina were temporary, and Michael, wanting peace, often obliged. What neither of them realized yet was that Evelyn wasn't simply guarding her son. She was preparing for something, shaping him little by little to trust her judgment above his wife's, to view her guidance as wisdom rather than interference. It was subtle, calculated, effective. The shift began during the summer of 2021, on the day Evelyn first mentioned in revising her estate plan. They were all seated in her immaculate living room, the one with the cream-colored furniture and the antique cabinet filled with family mementos. Evelyn had just brewed tea. The conversation was harmless at first, weather, health, work. But then she turned to Michael, not even glancing at Alina, and said in a tone that carried more weight than the words themselves, "I think it's time to finalize the future, to make sure everything ends up where it belongs." Michael nodded, oblivious to the implication. Alina felt a tightening in her chest, a sensation she couldn't explain at the time. She brushed it aside, telling herself she was imagining things. But she wasn't. Over the next 18 months, the dynamic changed in ways that only hindsight made clear. Evelyn began calling more frequently, sometimes late at night. Whenever Alina approached, the calls would end abruptly. When Michael asked, she'd say, "It was nothing important, dear, just checking on you." She began inviting him to lunches alone, sending texts that read like reminders rather than conversations. "Don't forget who has always been in your corner. You know I only want what's best for you. Be careful with decisions that affect your future." Subtle suggestions, each one planting a seed. According to one family friend who preferred not to be named, Evelyn had once confided that she needed to protect the family's legacy from outsiders. The friend reportedly brushed it off as typical controlling mother behavior. But as time unfolded, that statement revealed its true weight. By the winter of 2022, the distance between Michael and Alina had grown in ways neither could articulate. Their conversations felt shorter. Their disagreements lingered longer. And whenever money was discussed, spending, saving, investments, there was a tension that hadn't existed before. Michael insisted it was stress, work pressure, fatigue. But Alina sensed something deeper, something he either couldn't admit or didn't want to face. She began noticing documents missing from their shared files, passwords changed on accounts they once accessed together, conversations that ended the moment she entered the room. And every time she mentioned her concerns, Michael grew defensive. "You're overthinking," he'd say. "My mom isn't trying to control anything. She's just looking out for me." But looking out had never felt so intrusive. The turning point came in April of 2023, 10 days before Evelyn's unexpected hospitalization. It was a conversation Alina overheard by accident, the kind that unravels a marriage in seconds. Michael was pacing the hallway outside their bedroom, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone. She couldn't hear every word, but the few she caught were enough. "Yes, I know. She doesn't need to know. It's better this way. I'll sign whatever you asked me to. Just send it tonight." She froze. Fear bloomed in her stomach. She wanted to ask him right then, to demand answers, but when he walked back inside and saw her awake, he simply smiled, kissed her forehead, and said he loved her. The lie landed softly like dust, settling over a blueprint long in the making. 8 days later, Evelyn collapsed in her kitchen. Doctors said it was heart complications. Unexpected but not unheard of at her age. She was admitted for monitoring, but within hours it became clear she wouldn't recover. And during those hours, while family members whispered prayers and nurses checked monitors, Michael disappeared twice to make phone calls he wouldn't talk about. On the final night, as Evelyn's breathing slowed and the machines continued their soft, rhythmic hum, he sat beside her, whispering something no one else heard. By the next morning, she was gone. Her funeral drew relatives from across the state. People who hadn't spoken in years came dressed in black, sharing memories of her strength, her discipline, her resilience. Some cried openly, some didn't cry at all. But throughout the day, one thing was clear. Evelyn had been a woman of influence, and her passing left a void many would feel deeply. But it wasn't grief that altered the course of this family. It was paperwork, documents, signatures, dates, decisions made long before the burial. 2 weeks after the funeral, a call came from the estate lawyer's office, summoning Michael and Alina to discuss the transfer of assets. They arrived together, but the distance between them felt like miles. The office smelled of leather and oak, filled with towering shelves of legal volumes and framed certifications. The lawyer, a man in his 60s with a weary expression, folded his hands and took a slow breath before speaking. As per Evelyn Donovan's updated estate instructions, he began softly, her assets will transfer directly to her son. Alina waited for the rest, the part where her name appeared, the part where everything was shared, as Evelyn had always claimed it would be. But the next words hit like ice water. You were removed as co-beneficiary. Michael didn't look at her, not when the lawyer slid the folder across the desk, not when she saw the date printed on the revision, not when she realized it had been signed the same night she overheard him whispering on the phone. Her hands trembled, her breath thinned. She asked the only question that made sense. We saw. Michael didn't answer, but the truth was already exposed, buried in ink, signatures, and choices made behind her back. The inheritance was gone, the trust was broken. And the man she thought she knew was no longer standing beside her. He was sitting across from her, on the other side of everything. Michael didn't speak on the drive home. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went pale, his eyes fixed on the road as if looking at her would force him to confront what he'd done. The air between them felt suffocating, a thick silence layered with years of trust that had suddenly turned fragile. Alina stared out the window, replaying every moment of the past 2 years, every whispered call, every unexplained change in behavior, every time he had chosen his mother's voice over hers. The betrayal wasn't a single moment, it was a slow erosion, a quiet undoing disguised as loyalty. That night, long after Michael had gone to bed, she returned to his office. The room smelled faintly of cedar and toner, the shelves lined with financial books she had never bothered to read. She searched for answers, for logic, for anything that made sense. And there, tucked in the bottom drawer of his locked cabinet, she found it, the draft of the earlier will, the one that still listed her name. And clipped behind it was a printed email from Evelyn, time-stamped exactly 3 weeks before she died. It read, "You must protect what is rightfully yours. She will drain you if you don't take control now. Don't hesitate. I've set everything up." There was no warmth in the words, only manipulation disguised as maternal guidance. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that shattered the last piece of hope she had held on to. The ink slightly smeared, likely written in haste. This is your duty. Don't let her interfere. Reports later suggested that this wasn't Evelyn's first attempt at influencing her son's financial decisions. A family acquaintance recalled her saying years earlier that wives come and go, but blood stays. At the time, no one questioned her, but now those words carried an entirely different weight. The next morning, Alina placed the documents on the dining table. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting thin shadows across the pages. Michael approached cautiously, his expression unreadable. When he saw what she had found, his face tightened. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "You hid it from me," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "We saw," he exhaled slowly, pressing a hand against the back of a chair. "You don't understand what she was going through. She was scared, fragile. She needed reassurance. She needed control," Alina whispered, "and you handed it to her. You let her erase me." He looked at her then, And for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or the realization of consequences he hadn't been ready to face. "It wasn't about you," he said quietly. "It was about family, about keeping things the way they were supposed to be." "Supposed to be according to who?" she asked. "Because secrets don't protect families, Michael. They destroy them." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked away, leaving the documents scattered across the table like remnants of a battle neither of them had prepared for. In the weeks that followed, their home became divided. Conversations were replaced with curt exchanges. Meals were eaten in silence. Every attempt at honesty felt like an accusation. And beneath it all, the inheritance loomed like a ghost neither of them could outrun. $2.9 million. Money that had been used as a weapon, a lever, a wedge. But the story didn't end there, because what came next would expose more than anyone expected. 3 months after the estate meeting, Alina received a call from a woman she didn't recognize. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly. "My name is Marissa," she said. I, I used to work with your mother-in-law, and I think you need to know something." They met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Marissa was in her early 50s, her posture tense, her eyes darting as though afraid of being overheard. She placed a folder on the table. "I didn't come sooner," she said, "because I wasn't sure it was my place. But after she passed, I kept thinking about what she said to me, about what she was planning." Inside the folder were photocopied emails, financial summaries, and handwritten notes. Conversations between Evelyn and a private advisor she used for years. In them, she discussed strategies to preserve the estate from outside claims, limit spousal access, and ensure the family's legacy stays intact despite marital complications. One message included a direct suggestion to encourage Michael to restructure accounts before it's too late. But the document that changed everything was dated a month before she collapsed. A letter addressed to her advisor read, "Once these transfers are complete, nothing she does can alter the outcome. He will be secure, and the money will be protected from her influence." Protected from her. The implication was clear. Evelyn believed Alina would take the money, that she was a threat, that the marriage was a risk to the financial empire she had built. But reports later indicated something else entirely. Several colleagues of Alina's, interviewed anonymously, recalled her refusing financial gifts, insisting on splitting expenses, and avoiding dependence on her husband's income. She wasn't the type to chase money, one colleague said. She valued stability, not wealth. Yet Evelyn had built an entire strategy around that fear. As Marissa closed the folder, her voice softened. "She spoke about you often, not kindly. She said you were changing him, and that scared her. I think she wanted to keep him tethered." It wasn't greed alone then. It was possession, a fear of losing the one person she still controlled. The next step in the unraveling came from an unexpected place: the financial discrepancies in the estate itself. While reviewing routine records, the estate lawyer noticed irregularities: transfers made shortly before Evelyn's hospitalization, documents time-stamped at odd hours, signatures that appeared rushed. Out of protocol, he sought a third-party audit. The audit revealed something startling. Not all of the funds had gone where the revised will claimed. A portion, nearly $400,000, had been moved into an account that wasn't directly tied to Michael. An account under Evelyn's name but with a secondary authorized user. The secondary user was Michael, but there was no beneficiary listed. And no one, not even Michael, seemed to know where the remaining balance had gone. When the lawyer confronted him, Michael appeared genuinely shocked. He insisted he had never accessed the account, and records supported this. There were no login attempts from his devices, no withdrawals, no activity fingerprints. The money had vanished. This discovery shifted the tone of the case. What had seemed like a straightforward inheritance sabotage now carried undertones of premeditation far beyond emotional manipulation. There were inconsistencies, missing assets, unanswered questions about Evelyn's intentions and her true plans for the estate. Investigators reviewed Evelyn's digital history, scanning through years of communications. Buried within archived folders were drafts of emails she never sent, including one addressed to an attorney specializing in asset protection. "I'm concerned about the future. If anything happens to me unexpectedly, certain assets should remain undisclosed for now." Undisclosed for now. The phrase became a turning point. As further records were uncovered, a chilling pattern emerged. Evelyn had been preparing not just for her passing, but for a scenario in which control extended beyond her death. A scenario where her son would remain financially tethered to her decisions, even without her guidance. And in her efforts to secure this future, she had manipulated the very person she claimed to love most. For Alina, the unraveling was both painful and clarifying. She began to see her husband not as a villain, but as a man caught in a web spun long before he ever realized he was trapped. But understanding didn't erase betrayal, and forgiveness didn't come easily. The breaking point arrived on a quiet Thursday evening, 6 months after the funeral. Michael found her in the living room, sorting through more documents, the weight of truth heavy in her expression. He sat across from her, looking exhausted, defeated. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know everything she was doing." "I believe you," she said softly. "But you still made a choice. You let her speak for you. You let her turn you against me." He closed his eyes, pain flickering through his features. "I didn't realize how much she influenced me. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting our future." "By erasing me from it?" she asked. Silence. There were no words left. In the months that followed, they separated quietly. No anger, no public spectacle. Just two people acknowledging that love wasn't enough to rebuild a foundation fractured by secrets and control. Reports from acquaintances later described their separation as calm but heartbreaking, the kind that didn't involve shouting or blame, just acceptance. Michael kept the inheritance, not out of greed, but because legally there was no mechanism to reverse the will unless fraud could be proven, and Evelyn's intent was buried beneath layers of plausible, if controlling, decisions. But the money brought him no relief. Those who knew him said he withdrew from friends, became quieter at work, and carried a guilt that seemed to haunt him. As for the missing funds, they were never recovered. Some theorized Evelyn hid them intentionally, meant to be discovered later. Others believed she transferred them impulsively in a final attempt to maintain control. The truth, like so many shadows in this story, remained elusive. Alina rebuilt her life slowly. She moved to a smaller home, returned to counseling full-time, and focused on healing the pieces of herself that had been overlooked for too long. She never sought revenge, never spoke ill of Michael publicly. Those close to her said she carried herself with grace, even through heartbreak. And when asked privately how she felt about the inheritance, she answered only, "Freedom has a cost. I paid mine." But the haunting part of this story isn't the money, it's the silence. The long stretches of quiet where decisions were made without conversation. The whispered instructions, the secrets exchanged in hallways and behind closed doors. The belief that protecting someone means controlling them. It was in those moments, long before any document was signed, that the real betrayal took root. And in the end, the truth was exposed, slowly, painfully, irrevocably. Not through confrontation, but through discovery. And that is what lingers in stories like this. The realization that sometimes the most devastating betrayals aren't loud. They don't break down doors or leave physical scars. They creep in quietly, through trust misused and love distorted, until the moment you realize the person standing beside you has been drifting away for years. Thank you for sitting with this story. If you have ever experienced a betrayal that unfolded in silence, or a truth that changed everything in your life, tell us how you found the strength to move forward. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. Do you think justice was ever possible in this case? Or are some wounds too deep to repair, even when the truth is finally brought into the light? And as you reflect on this story, consider this. Sometimes the darkest secrets aren't buried in vaults or locked behind passwords. Sometimes they live quietly inside the people we love. And when they finally rise to the surface, the damage has already been done. As we close this documentary, I'd like to know your honest thoughts. Which moment struck you the hardest? And what would you have done if you were in Alina's place? Your insight keeps these stories alive, reminding us that the cost of silence is far greater than we often realize. If you want more deep, haunting investigations like this one, stories that peel back the layers of loyalty, greed, and betrayal, stay with us. There are more truths waiting to be uncovered, more shadows waiting to be exposed.